In academic philosophy, people primarily play with concepts that are difficult to understand, but easy to live with. In the realm of politics, we tend to deal with concepts that are easy to understand, but hard to deal with. What I'm going to talk about in this video sounds very abstruse and abstract, but it's really a pragmatic fact of life. Easy to understand, hard to live with. An abstraction simply contains less information than the things it is abstracted from. A generalization is always, and by definition, something less real than the things you're generalizing about. The problem we deal with in politics again and again is that people want to treat generalizations as more real, as more important than the things being generalized about. So in a recent video, I talked about socialism versus capitalism this way. And I opened by saying, hey, people think of themselves as a socialist as an identity. And then they don't think about politics in terms of pragmatic problem solving, like, hey, we need to build prisons. How are we going to have prisons that work well for the prisoners, that work well for society as a whole, in terms of law and order or whatever concept, social harmony, shall we say, prisons that work well for the parents and relatives and friends of the prisoners who want to visit them. There are a lot of prisons that work well for the employees of the prison, let's not forget, where it's humane and you have positive, well-motivated employees at the prison who don't hate their lives, who don't regard themselves as being punished by working in a prison too, right? All kinds of different factors where there's no corruption and no drug dealing. Okay, we need well-working prisons. And you have people who think of themselves as socialists and who absolutely presume that the answer to this question is socialism and that the problem is capitalism. Meanwhile, in the real world, if you look around, most of the worst run prisons on planet Earth are socialist. They're government prisons. And people don't even think of them that way. They don't even perceive them that way. They will just say, oh yeah, in Brazil, the prisons are terrible. It doesn't even matter. In Kentucky, the prisons are terrible. In England, in Canada, the prisons are terrible. It doesn't really matter. Oh yeah, that's a bad prison. It's really terrible. Oh really? Is it owned by Coca-Cola Corporation? Oh no, it's run by the government. That's socialism, right? People, left-wing people, I'm left of center myself. What can I tell you? I endorsed Bernie Sanders rather than Joe Biden in the last American presidential election, even though I was a very harsh critic of Bernie Sanders and I found all kinds of things wrong with his program and I read his book. Nevertheless, I'm certainly someone who's left of center, right? I understand that mentality. I grew up with that mentality. That's why I'm trying to productively criticize that mentality. It's very easy to presume that any prison that is for-profit and capitalist is going to be exploitative of the workers, the prisoners, the system, that it's just motivated by the love of profit and filthy lucre. And therefore, definitionally, such a prison is worse than a socialist prison. But if you actually let yourself look around, right? If you learn a truth from facts, if you work from empirical reality, what you're going to find, it's quite contradictory and confusing, okay? The reality is, in some countries, you can find some examples of wonderful, well-run government prisons, socialist prisons, right? And you can find the worst prisons in the world, both in wealthy first world countries and in poverty-stricken third world countries, are government-run, are socialist prisons. And yes, I followed up my last video by giving a link to an example in South Africa, where there's this example of a prison. It may be the best prison, not just in Africa, but the best prison in the whole world. This wonderful prison in South Africa that's run by a private for-profit company. And it's making people re-examine the whole question of how do we run prisons in Africa and how do we want to run prisons in Europe and so on. And you can watch this YouTube video. They interview the staff, and the staff all seem positively motivated and happy to come to work. And the prisoners are all happy, and they're all learning a new trade and learning education. And it's safe, and it's clean, and it's this optimistic, wonderful place. You go, wow, this is this really well-run prison. And we can't reduce this explanation. We cannot explain this in terms of the category of socialism versus capitalism, because those are generalizations, right? And the generalizations are less real than the things they generalize about. Okay? What is a good university and what is a bad university? Some of the best universities in the world are socialist or government-run nonprofit entities, right? Many of the worst universities in the world, I would even say the vast majority of the worst universities in the world, are socialist, government-run nonprofit universities. And people don't even think in these terms. Again, people like myself, people on the left, we don't let ourselves perceive reality that way. We think, oh, that's a bad prison. That prison is corrupt. The prison guards are corrupt. Or that prison is violent and brutal and dirty and depressing. We don't think that's because of socialism. We don't want to put it in that category, right? This kind of cherry picking that goes on. And likewise, the universities. Oh yeah, we know some high schools are bad and some universities are bad, and we will blame everything imaginable except socialism. And then conversely, we, again, I'm left of center myself, when we look at a really great high school or a really great university or a really great prison that is run by the private sector, we will not want to put it in that column of attributing it to capitalism or the free market. We don't want to give credit to those right-wing or conservative ideas and ideals, because we don't have a mentality of learning truth from facts, of examining and analyzing empirical reality to then generalize about it. We are treating the generalizations as something primary and the real world as something secondary that exists in the shadow of those abstractions. So this is a real philosophical problem with pragmatic implications in the real world. I have a letter from a viewer of the channel, supporter of mine on Patreon, called Ivansky. I assume that's his real name. He says, "Hi Eisel, this video," referring to my old video, "this video has confused me a little about your views. I'm not sure of what the parameters of this identity-free politics problem-solving approach are." So he was interpreting my video as if my point was to say, look, don't think of yourself as a socialist. Don't think of yourself as a conservative. Right? Don't let these generalizations or abstractions define your identity and define the way you think about politics. Instead, have a pragmatic problem-solving approach. And that's not a gross misinterpretation of my earlier video, but he's slightly off the mark in an important sense, right? So he then asks, so it's a good question, by the way. It's a totally good question. Okay, well, what does this mean in practice moving forward, right? So what are you saying? Are you saying, like, quote, does it mean that you're indifferent if America becomes more socialist, whatever that term means, so long as it adequately satisfies the challenges of the country and remains capitalist where it matters? Question mark. Or say China remains communist. I guess China is interesting as it has done well in some ways, being a communist country that functions very much like a capitalist country, albeit under autocratic government. Now, just pause. If you look at how universities are run, and if you look at how prisons are run, you might find communist China is no different from Canada, Denmark, the United States, England. That actually, when you look at what the government does in practice, it is neither more nor less democratic than the institutions in our own society, which, by the way, I do not regard as a good thing. I regard it as a sign of the extent to which our so-called democratic countries are, in a meaningful sense, not democratic at all. That they are bureaucratic and aristocratic to a greater extent than we want to admit to ourselves. Okay, continuing. Quote, do you mean that in capitalistic societies, we should simply be open to using socialist approaches where it is appropriate or efficient? Question mark. Okay, so my point is deeper than that, right? It's more fundamental and it's more simple. Okay, point. We should be open to using socialist approaches where it's appropriate, he says. When is it appropriate? We don't know, all right? We live our lives in this way where we treat the generalization and the abstraction as something first and foremost. And what is it we're generalizing about? We are generalizing about the behavior, the conduct, the intelligence of about 5 people. Any given prison, the whole institution, the conduct of all the employees, who gets hired, who gets fired, the standard of self-discipline, the way the prison is run, it probably reflects about 5 people at the top. There are probably 5 people who are in a management role, and they shape the way day-to-day activities at the prison are. They shape the attitude and conduct of their employees. You know, it's not even necessarily that they are corrupt themselves, But if they are tolerating corrupt employees, right, their attitudes, their managerial focus, then that results in corruption throughout the whole institution. If they have a really upbeat, positive attitude that, hey, we're not here to punish people, we're here to educate people and help them re-enter the workforce, that attitude is going to shape everyone else working in that prison. And of course, it's partly in who gets hired and who gets fired and how they get trained and what their instructions are, right? You could have 5 people with a really great attitude in management positions at a prison that happens to be owned by the government and run on a nonprofit basis. You could have people with, and they might get paid really poorly. They might get paid less than minimum wage, but they feel, for whatever combination of reasons, this is the meaning of life for them. This is something really important. They're going to do the best job they possibly can. You have a great prison that's being run that way. And some idiot on YouTube can sit back and generalize and say, see, this proves that the system works. This proves that a nonprofit socialist model is the best way to run a prison. And then there's some other prison in the private sector, like the one I mentioned in South Africa that has this documentary about it. Why is that prison so great? Okay, it's not because of the profit motive. It's not because of the stock market. It's not because of capitalism. It's not like, oh, well, it's because the 5 people at the top are paid a higher salary, which they probably are, being private sector. The people lower down in the prison, they may be paid a lower salary, by the way, private sector being what it is. It's not going to be something simple like the salary or the stock market or capitalism versus socialism. You happen to have 5 people working together to make this a success, to make this the best prison it could possibly fucking be. Right? They had people who were passionate and visionary and inspired and who did a great job running or reorganizing or renovating this prison or all of the above. People who really cared. Right? Why is one restaurant good and another restaurant bad? Right? You can try to generalize about it, but these generalizations can be fundamentally counterproductive and misleading. So then we have people, again, no offense to my audience, but by and large, the people I meet and deal with in politics, by and large, all of us assembled here to watch this YouTube video, we go through life treating the abstractions, treating the generalities, the generalizations, I should say, treating the generalizations as the primary fact guiding our decisions, as what it is we know, right? That the choice we make is between socialism and capitalism, is between for-profit and non-profit, and we have this profound reluctance to deal with the muddy, contradictory reality of what it is that made one institution work and another fail. Who today among us is studying what makes some universities successful and others a failure? And we have no culture of secrecy here in the West, right? It's not that it's concealed from us. Nobody cares. We all treat this as a divine mystery. Right? Oh, well, some universities are really good and some are, oh yeah. It's just ridiculous. And it's the most important thing in all of our lives. We recognize that. Whether you have a successful career or not has everything to do with what university you go to and whether or not you go to university. And once you get to that university, whether you drop out or whether you complete the program, and then whether or not you're actually prepared to begin a career after that, whether or not you have a chance, whether or not you have a shot at survival, let's not understate the case, depends on you having educational institutions in your life that are worth a damn. And nobody seems to care about examining why so many of them, socialist or private sector, produce diplomas that are not worth the paper it's printed on. And we're all bankrupting ourselves. We're all going into debt and taking out student loans, and our parents spending their money to provide us with an education where there is no educational opportunity, where we learn nothing and we become nothing, and we're set up for failure. Got in touch with an old friend, old acquaintance, loosely speaking, finished his degree at the same university I was at, and he's now bagging groceries at the same grocery store where he had a job while he was in high school. Enjoy your career. What did your university degree in Asian studies prepare you for? I've talked about this stuff, again and again. All of these things matter. I mean, whether it's prisons or the education system, right? But our own attitude towards government is actively precluding the possibility of learning from experience, where instead we try to rule and we try to make these decisions in terms of generalities. Okay, I'll just finish reading the letter. So he says, should we be open to using socialist approaches where it is appropriate or where it is efficient? Again, I'm saying we don't know. What is the best way to set up a telecom company, to set up a cell phone service in a third world country? What is the best way to set up electrical generation? The generation of electricity, every country around the world is a mix of government and private for profit. Most people never look into this. Most people never question, where does the electricity coming out of my light bulb really come from? How is it made? It's a complex, self-contradictory balancing act of private for profit and nonprofit socialist elements. And what works and what doesn't cannot be easily generalized about. Okay? Question. That we should be open to aspects of other ideologies, question mark. How does this relate to your own views on bigger economies like the US, UK, Australia, China, etc.? Okay? The most profound problem we have in politics today is that we don't choose solutions to problems, and we don't even choose the person who's going to attempt the solution. We merely choose the kind of process whereby that decision is made, and we call it a democracy. Right? What we have today is a system of government like arranged marriage, where you don't get to choose who you marry, you don't get to choose who you have sex with or who you fall in love with, but you have a choice of several different systems of someone else making that choice on your behalf. We've yet to hit the breaking point of realizing it doesn't matter whether you have a Hindu family arranged marriage where, your grandparents and aunts and uncles conspire to find you a husband or wife and set you up, or if you have more of a Muslim system of arranged marriage. It doesn't matter if you have a 21st century website-based arranged marriage. We get to the point of realizing no matter what system of representation I choose, someone else representing me, someone else making this decision on my behalf is never going to work. I have to choose who I'm going to marry for myself. We have a system of so-called representative democracy where other people make decisions on your behalf. All you get to choose is the system of representation, and then you choose. In the same way, it would be like choosing what grandmother is going to choose your wife or your husband, right? Well, I don't get to choose my wife or husband, but I get to choose my representative within my family for who's going to make that decision, and then I trust their decision. On what basis do we choose these so-called representatives? We choose them on the basis of generalizations. We choose them on the basis of abstractions. We elect Bernie Sanders, who calls himself a fucking socialist, whatever that means, and we'll get to sit here and debate what it means. Or we choose Joe Biden, who calls himself a capitalist and represents 95% of the same public policies, right? We get to sit around and debate what that means. We get to choose an abstraction. We get to choose a generalization without even knowing what it is we're generalizing about. And then we sit back and watch what happens to the prison system, to the university system. We never make the choice. We never get to control what happens in our universities, in our prisons, because we don't have direct democracy. We have a system of democracy every bit as phony as an arranged marriage.